The Mafia boss secretly witnessed the black maid's compassion. It changed him forever. Sarah Jenkins had been working in the Romano household for nearly a year. She was quiet, efficient, and kept to herself. Sarah was not like the others who worked in the mansion. She didn't wear expensive clothes or speak in the same polished manner as the guests who frequented the estate. She was the maid, the one who cleaned the grand rooms and polished the silverware, always in the background, unnoticed. It wasn't that she didn't have her own dreams or desires. Sarah had dreams, big ones. She dreamed of a life where she could give her younger brother the chance to attend college, a life where she could finally pay off the debts left behind by her late mother. But for now, her reality was simple. She worked hard, she stayed quiet, and she kept her head down. One afternoon, as Sarah was dusting the grand staircase, she overheard voices from the lavish dining room. There was a family gathering, and the Romano family was hosting an elegant dinner for some important guests. The chatter was loud and filled with laughter, but Sarah didn't pay much attention to it. That was, until one of the guests, a woman in a bright red dress, raised her voice in a harsh tone. "Can you believe they let someone like her clean the place?" The woman sneered, loud enough for Sarah to hear from the hallway. Sarah felt the sting of the words, her heart sinking into her stomach. She had been mocked before, but it still hurt. She paused for a moment, steadying herself before continuing her work. She had learned to let these moments slide, to ignore them, because she couldn't afford to show weakness. She couldn't afford to give anyone a reason to look down on her any more than they already did. What she didn't know was that Dominic Romano, the Mafia boss of the Romano family, had been standing by the door, observing the entire interaction. He had been silent, watching the scene unfold before him, and his sharp eyes caught the subtle tension in Sarah's shoulders. Dominic wasn't one to show much emotion. His expression was always cold, his demeanor even colder. But there was something about seeing Sarah, the maid, so vulnerable, so quietly enduring the insult, that made him pause. He watched as she collected herself, straightened her back, and resumed dusting without a word. Something stirred within him. It wasn't anger, not at first. It was a deep, inexplicable feeling of respect. She didn't fight back. She didn't seek pity. She just endured. For a brief moment, he felt something he had never felt before, compassion. It was foreign, uncomfortable, and unsettling, yet he couldn't ignore it. He watched Sarah continue her work, her face calm, but her hands trembling ever so slightly. There was something powerful about her, something that made him reconsider everything he had ever known about strength. In that moment, he realized that true strength wasn't about power or control. It was about resilience. It was about having the courage to endure without seeking validation or revenge. As Sarah walked past him to collect another cleaning cloth, she didn't notice him. But Dominic noticed her. He watched her, his gaze softening, his mind racing with thoughts he had never allowed himself to entertain before. For the first time in years, Dominic felt something he couldn't explain. Something shifted inside him. And he knew, deep down, that it was all because of Sarah Jenkins. It had been a few days since Dominic had seen Sarah in the same light, and something inside him stirred every time their paths crossed in the vast mansion. He found himself paying more attention to her, watching her go about her work with a quiet grace that, for some reason, made him feel unsettled. He wasn't used to feeling this way. Dominating, powerful, and ruthless, those were the qualities that defined him. He had spent his life building an empire of wealth and control, and yet here was this woman, a maid, someone he should have overlooked, making him question everything he thought he knew about strength and weakness. The days passed in a blur of meetings, phone calls, and the usual power struggles that came with being the head of one of the most feared families in the city. But Sarah was never far from his thoughts. He kept seeing her face, her calm demeanor in the midst of chaos, her ability to endure the insults thrown at her without so much as a flinch. It was remarkable. One evening, as he sat in his study, his mind wandering yet again to Sarah, he heard a soft knock on the door. It was Sarah, standing in the doorway, holding a tray with a glass of whiskey. "Mr. Romano," she said softly, her voice quiet and measured. "I thought you might like a drink." Dominic looked up from his papers, surprised to see her there. "Thank you," he said, his voice lower than usual. He hadn't expected her to come in, especially not so late in the evening. She set the tray down on his desk, her movements graceful but purposeful. As she turned to leave, Dominic found himself speaking before he could stop himself. Sarah. She paused, looking back at him, her eyes cautious but steady. Yes, Mr. Romano? Stay for a moment, he said, his voice less commanding than he intended. Sarah hesitated for a brief moment, then nodded and took a step back into the room, closing the door behind her. She didn't question him, didn't ask why he wanted her there. Instead, she simply waited. There was an awkward silence between them as Dominic poured himself a drink, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't seem to process. He hadn't planned on saying anything. He hadn't planned on this moment at all. But something about the way she was standing there, so calm, so composed, made him want to speak. You've been here for a while now, he said, trying to break the silence. How long has it been? Almost a year, Sarah replied, her tone polite but neutral. I've been working here since last spring. Dominic nodded, his eyes narrowing as he thought for a moment. You've never said anything about yourself, he said, almost as if to himself. Never complained, never asked for more. Sarah looked at him, and for the first time, Dominic noticed a flicker of something in her eyes. Was it sadness? Or maybe something else? What is there to say? She replied softly. I do my job. I work. That's all. Her words were simple, but they carried a weight to them. Dominic stared at her for a long moment, realizing how little he knew about the woman who had been working under his roof for almost a year. She had never asked for anything, never demanded special treatment. She had simply come in every day, done her job, and kept her head down. He found that strange. It wasn't like anything he had ever experienced. You don't think you deserve more? He asked, the question slipping out before he could stop himself. Sarah didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked down at the floor for a moment, her fingers gently tracing the edge of the tray she had placed on his desk. I'm not here to take anything from anyone, she finally said. I'm just here to do what I can. Dominic felt a strange pull in his chest at her words. There was something in her quiet strength, her humility, that made him feel something. He couldn't name it, but it was there, lingering in the space between them. He took a sip of his drink, trying to shake off the feeling. He had never been one to question his instincts, but Sarah was making him feel like he was losing control. You're a strange one, he said, more to himself than to her. Sarah gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. I'm just trying to get by, Mr. Romano, just like everyone else. There it was again, the quiet resilience, the refusal to let the world break her. Dominic found himself watching her, really watching her for the first time. He had seen her hundreds of times before, but he had never truly noticed her until now. She wasn't just a maid. She wasn't just someone who cleaned the mansion. She was someone who had endured hardship, someone who had seen things he would never understand. And yet, here she was, still standing. I respect that, Dominic said, his voice softening. He didn't know why he said it, but the words felt right. He wasn't sure what had changed in him, but something was different now. Sarah nodded, her expression unreadable. Thank you, Mr. Romano. The moment lingered between them, heavy and unspoken. Dominic realized he had no idea what to do with this feeling, this new awareness he had of her. He had always been in control, always the one who called the shots. But now, for the first time in his life, he felt uncertain. You can go now, he said, his voice returning to its usual coldness. Thank you for the drink. Sarah nodded once, turning to leave. But before she reached the door, she paused, looking back at him. Good night, Mr. Romano. Dominic watched her go, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't shake. Something had changed. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew it had. Something to do with Sarah Jenkins. The days following that evening felt different for both Sarah and Dominic. For Sarah, it was as if a subtle shift had occurred. She continued to do her work as usual, but there was a strange awareness in the air whenever Dominic was near. It wasn't that he had said anything more to her, or that he had treated her differently outwardly, but there was something unspoken between them, a new layer of understanding. She wasn't sure what it meant, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Dominic was watching her more closely than before. Meanwhile, Dominic found himself increasingly distracted by Sarah. The way she moved through the mansion, quietly going about her work, always with a certain grace. He had always been a man who understood power and control, who knew how to make people bend to his will. But Sarah was different. She didn't seem to need anything from him, at least not in the way others did. She wasn't after his money, his status, or even his attention. And yet, There was something magnetic about her. It frustrated him. He couldn't stop thinking about the conversation they had shared. His mind kept returning to her words, the way she had talked about doing her job without asking for more. It was humbling, in a way, and it made him question the very foundation of everything he had built. As the days went by, Dominic found himself seeking reasons to cross paths with Sarah. He would stop by the kitchen more often, or walk through the hallways where he knew she would be working. He didn't speak to her much, but he watched. And every time he did, he found himself wondering what it was that made her so different. On one particular evening, as the sun set and the golden light poured through the grand windows, Dominic found himself in the library, reading through a stack of reports. He had been working late, as usual, when he heard the soft sound of footsteps behind him. He looked up to find Sarah standing in the doorway, holding a tray with a freshly poured glass of wine. She was wearing her usual Maid uniform, but there was something about her that night, something in the way she stood there, looking at him with calm eyes. "I thought you might want a drink, Mr. Romano," she said, her voice soft and steady, like it always was. "Thank you," Dominic replied, his voice almost strained as he set the papers aside. "You're welcome," she said, her expression neutral as she set the tray on the table beside him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Sarah stood there, waiting for him to take the glass, but Dominic didn't reach for it right away. Instead, he studied her face, noticing the way the light from the setting sun caught her features. There was a quiet strength in her, something he hadn't fully realized before. She wasn't like the others in his life. She wasn't pretending, she wasn't trying to impress him, and she certainly wasn't looking for anything. And yet, there she was, standing before him, offering him a drink, just like she had done so many times before. But this time, it felt different. "You don't ask for much, do you?" Dominic asked, his voice low. Sarah looked at him for a moment, then shook her head slightly. "I don't need much, Mr. Romano," she replied. "Just enough to get by." There was a pause before she added, "And I'm grateful for the work I have here." Dominic felt something stir inside him at her words, something that had been building ever since that first moment when he had watched her handle the humiliation with such quiet dignity. He wasn't used to this kind of humility. He wasn't used to people who didn't want anything from him. It was unsettling, and it made him feel exposed in a way he wasn't comfortable with. "What's it like?" he asked, his voice a little more raw than he had intended. "Living like this, I mean. Working here, doing what you do." Sarah hesitated for a moment, her eyes meeting his. "It's not easy," she said quietly, "but it's honest work. And that's enough for me." Dominic leaned back in his chair, studying her. "I don't think I could do it," he said after a long pause. "I don't think I could live without wanting more, without seeking something beyond what I already have." Sarah's expression softened, but she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked down at the tray in front of her, her fingers resting lightly on the edge. "Maybe that's the difference between us," she said finally, her voice almost a whisper. "You've always had everything. And I've always had to make do with what I have." Dominic didn't know what to say. He couldn't remember the last time someone had spoken to him like that. Sarah didn't see him as the Mafia boss, the man who controlled everything and everyone around him. She saw him as just another person, someone who was just as flawed as the rest of them. And that, more than anything, made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. It made him feel human. For the first time in a long time, Dominic wasn't sure who he was anymore. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do next, or how he was supposed to move forward. But he knew one thing. Sarah had made him question everything. And somehow, that felt like the beginning of something new. It was a week later when the next change occurred, a subtle shift that no one could have predicted. Sarah had been working in the garden, trimming the hedges near the back of the mansion, when Dominic appeared in the doorway, his figure cutting a sharp contrast against the soft afternoon light. She didn't notice him at first, her focus solely on her task, but when she heard his voice, she looked up, surprised. "You've been busy," he said, his tone light, almost casual. Sarah wiped her brow, pushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "Just trying to keep the place in order, Mr. Romano." Dominic stepped closer, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. "I've noticed," he said quietly. There was a brief silence before he spoke again. "You're always working, always moving, always doing. Do you ever stop?" Sarah looked down at the pair of gardening gloves she was holding, her fingers gripping the leather tightly. "I don't need to stop. There's always something to do. Dominic studied her for a moment, as if trying to decipher something he couldn't quite grasp. Don't you ever wonder if there's more to life than just this? Than just surviving? Sarah blinked, momentarily taken aback by the question. No one had ever asked her that. She had never really thought about it. I don't know, she said slowly, her voice soft. I've always just worked, because that's what I had to do. I didn't have much of a choice. There was something about her words that lingered in the air, and for a moment, Dominic didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to people like Sarah, people who didn't ask for more, people who just took what they had and made do. It was alien to him. Maybe you don't have to keep going like this, he said finally, his voice tinged with a rare vulnerability. Maybe you deserve more. Sarah tilted her head slightly, her expression one of confusion. More, she asked. What do you mean by that? Dominic shifted his weight, suddenly feeling uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. I mean, you don't have to be invisible all the time. You don't have to work yourself into the ground just to get by. Sarah's brow furrowed slightly, and she took a step back, her eyes narrowing. I'm not invisible, she said quietly. I'm here. I'm working. I'm doing my best. I don't need anyone to see me. Dominic opened his mouth to respond, but the words stuck in his throat. He wasn't sure why he had said that, why he had let his guard down in front of her. You've been through a lot, haven't you? He asked, his voice gentler now. Sarah didn't answer at first. She simply stood there, staring at the ground. Finally, she nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. Everyone has their struggles, she said quietly, almost to herself. I'm no different. Dominic took a step closer to her, his gaze softening. You're not the same as everyone else, he said. I've seen what you can do. I've seen your strength. You don't have to hide it. For the first time in their brief conversation, Sarah's gaze met his, and in that moment, something shifted between them. She didn't know what it was, but it was there, lingering in the space between them. I'm just doing my job, she said, her voice steady. Nothing more, nothing less. Dominic was silent for a long moment, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't quite process. He didn't know what was happening to him, but he knew one thing. Sarah had made him see things differently. He had always believed in power, control, and the idea that only the strongest survived. But Sarah was showing him that maybe, just maybe, there was more to life than that. He had never known someone like her. Someone who worked not for recognition, not for power, but simply because it was the right thing to do. Someone who lived with dignity and strength, even when the world around her had treated her like she was invisible. And yet, in that moment, standing there in the garden, he realized that Sarah was anything but invisible. She was stronger than he had ever given her credit for. Sarah took a deep breath, breaking the silence. I should get back to work, she said, her voice cool and composed once more. Dominic nodded, watching her as she turned back to the garden. He couldn't help but feel a strange sense of admiration for her. There was something about her resilience, her quiet strength, that called to him in a way he hadn't expected. As Sarah bent down to continue her work, Dominic stood there for a moment longer, lost in thought. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he had all the answers. He didn't feel like he controlled everything around him. But somehow that felt okay. For the first time, he wasn't sure where the story would go next, and he couldn't help but wonder if that was a good thing. It had been a few days since their conversation in the garden, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Dominic had been different, more attentive, more present in the house, as if he were trying to understand something he couldn't quite grasp. She didn't know what to make of it. At first, it had seemed like just a passing moment, something that would fade into the background of her daily routine. But it hadn't. Every time their paths crossed, there was an unspoken tension in the air, something neither of them acknowledged, but both felt. Sarah continued to work, of course. She had her duties to attend to, her responsibilities that were as much a part of her as her own breath. But every time she saw Dominic, a part of her hesitated. He was the Mafia boss, after all. He was the one who controlled everything and everyone in this world, and she was just the maid. Nothing more, nothing less. And yet, something about the way he looked at her, the way he spoke to her, made her question everything she had ever believed about herself and her place in this world. One evening as Sarah was finishing up her duties in the kitchen, she found herself alone with Dominic once again. He was sitting at the grand table, his posture as commanding as ever, but there was something softer in his eyes that evening. He didn't speak at first, just watched her from across the room as she wiped down the counter. She didn't know why she had come into the kitchen at that exact moment. She should have gone to bed, but something had drawn her there, like an invisible thread tugging at her. "Sarah," Dominic said, his voice low, breaking the silence that had settled between them. She turned toward him, her heart skipping a beat. "Yes, Mr. Romano," she asked, her tone neutral, though she couldn't stop the nervousness creeping into her voice. "You've been working late again," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "You don't need to do this, you know." Sarah felt her throat tighten. She didn't know how to respond. She had been working late because there was always something that needed to be done, something that demanded her attention. It was the only way she knew how to exist in this world. "I'm fine," she said softly, turning back to the counter to finish wiping it down. But Dominic wasn't finished. He stood up and walked over to her, his footsteps heavy against the marble floor. "You don't have to keep doing this, Sarah," he said again, his voice softer now. "You don't have to keep working yourself to the bone for a place that won't even recognize your worth." Sarah's hand froze in midair as she was wiping the counter. She hadn't expected him to say something like that. She had always been invisible to people like him, a mere shadow in the background of their lives. But here he was, standing before her, offering something more than she could ever have imagined. "I do this because it's the only thing I know," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's what I've always done." Dominic's expression softened, and he reached out, gently touching her hand. "You're more than just a maid, Sarah," he said, his voice earnest. "You're more than this job, more than this place." She met his gaze then, really looked at him for the first time in a long while. She had always seen him as the powerful Mafia boss, the man who controlled everything with a mere word. But in that moment, she saw something else, something vulnerable, something human. She didn't know what to say. The words felt stuck in her throat, like they didn't belong there. Instead, she pulled her hand back slowly, stepping away from him. "I'm just doing my job," she said, the familiar walls rising up inside her once again. "That's all." Dominic didn't push her. He just stood there for a moment, watching her, his expression unreadable. "I don't want you to feel like this is all you are," he said quietly. "You deserve more than this." Sarah felt a sharp pang in her chest at his words. She didn't know how to respond. No one had ever said something like that to her before. No one had ever seen her as more than just a servant, a worker, someone who could be overlooked and ignored. But Dominic wasn't like the others. "I don't know what you want me to say," she said softly, her voice shaky. "I don't know how to be anything more than this." Dominic stepped closer to her, his eyes never leaving hers. "You don't have to figure it all out right now," he said gently. "But I want you to know that you're more than just this job. You're more than what you've been told you are." Sarah's heart raced as she looked up at him, his words sinking into her. She didn't know what to make of it, didn't know what to feel. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, there was something more for her. She didn't know what that was yet, but it felt like hope, a hope she had long buried deep inside. "Thank you, Mr. Romano," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know what else to say." Dominic smiled softly, his gaze warm. "You don't need to say anything," he replied. "Just know that you don't have to be invisible anymore." And with that, he turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Sarah standing there, alone with her thoughts. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. The following days passed in a haze of subtle changes. Sarah had noticed that Dominic was present more often, his presence lingering in the background as he navigated through the mansion with a quiet intensity. His eyes often found her in a room, but he never spoke directly to her unless necessary. She didn't mind the distance, though. She wasn't sure how to handle the shift between them, and she wasn't about to complicate things further by acknowledging the strange connection that had formed. She had always kept her emotions in check, had learned long ago that life didn't offer much room for softness. That night, after finishing her tasks, Sarah found herself standing near the window in the staff quarters, staring out at the quiet garden. The moonlight cast long shadows on the well-manicured grass, and the stillness of the night made her feel isolated in a way that was both comforting and unsettling. She had grown used to being alone, used to the silence that came with being a part of this world but not really a part of it. But as she gazed out at the night, she couldn't help but feel the weight of her own thoughts pressing down on her. She had spent so long convincing herself that this life was all she could have. Working, surviving, keeping her head down. But now, with Dominic's words echoing in her mind, she wasn't so sure. What if there was more? What if she could be more than just the maid? The thought scared her. She had always kept her distance from the people who had the power to change her life. But Dominic was different. She didn't understand it, but she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him, the way his presence stirred something inside her that she had buried deep down for years. She had to push those thoughts away. They didn't belong to someone like her. The next morning, she was busy in the kitchen when Dominic appeared, as unexpected as ever. He was standing by the counter, watching her as she worked, his eyes focused but distant. She felt a strange sense of familiarity in the way he was observing her, as though he was seeing her for the first time in a way that she had never imagined. "Good morning, Sarah," he said, breaking the silence. She looked up, startled by the sound of his voice. "Good morning, Mr. Romano," she replied, her voice steady, though a slight tremor betrayed her nerves. "You're up early," he remarked, his gaze flickering to the countertop where she was chopping vegetables. Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. There was an awkward pause before Dominic spoke again, his tone softer than usual. "I wanted to thank you for what you did the other night," he said. Sarah paused, her knife hovering over the cutting board. "What do you mean, sir?" she asked, genuinely unsure of what he was referring to. Dominic hesitated for a moment before answering, his expression unreadable. "For your honesty," he said, his voice low. "For speaking to me the way you did. No one else in my world has the courage to be that honest." Sarah didn't know what to say. She hadn't meant to be courageous, to make a statement. She had simply spoken the truth as it had come to her, without thinking. "I didn't mean to. I just said what was on my mind," she said quietly. Dominic studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he gave a small nod. "That's the thing," he said, almost to himself. "You don't have to hide behind anything. You just are." Sarah's heart skipped a beat at his words. She wasn't used to people seeing her like that, just as she was, without any pretense. It felt strange, almost vulnerable, but it also felt freeing. "I'm just doing my job," she replied, her voice steady, though she could feel her pulse quickening. Dominic didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached for a glass of water from the counter and took a sip, his gaze lingering on her. "You deserve more than this," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. "More than just being the maid, Sarah. You deserve to be seen, to be valued for who you truly are." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Sarah didn't know how to respond. She had always kept herself hidden, always kept her true self locked away. It was easier that way. But now, in the presence of Dominic's unwavering gaze, she felt a desire to be seen, to be acknowledged in a way she had never been before. She swallowed hard, trying to push the feeling aside. "I don't need much," she said softly. "I'm content with my life." Dominic didn't seem convinced, but he didn't press further. Instead, he turned and began to walk out of the kitchen, pausing at the door. "I just wanted you to know," he said, his voice quieter now, "that you're more than this. More than the work, more than the role you play. You're worth more than you think." Sarah stood there for a moment, her heart racing. She wasn't sure what to make of his words. But as she stood in the quiet kitchen, she couldn't help but feel a shift inside her. Dominic's words had unlocked something inside her, something she had kept buried for so long. Maybe she didn't have to live her life in the shadows. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of the small world she had created for herself. But whether she would take that step, whether she would let herself be seen, truly seen, was something she wasn't ready to face just yet. The days that followed felt like a strange, shifting dream. Sarah couldn't quite grasp the tension in the air. There were moments when it felt like everything between her and Dominic had changed, but the truth was, she wasn't sure what had changed at all. She went about her duties as usual, staying in the background, cleaning the rooms, tending to the estate's needs. But every time she crossed paths with Dominic, there was a subtle shift in the way he looked at her. It wasn't something she could put into words, but she felt it, like an invisible weight pressing between them. One evening, as she was walking down the grand hallway with a stack of fresh linens, she found herself nearly bumping into him. Dominic was standing at the far end of the hall, his back to her, as though he had been waiting for her. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, his dark eyes meeting hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "Sarah," he said quietly, his voice carrying through the silence. "Mr. Romano," she replied, instinctively lowering her gaze, though she couldn't help but feel a spark of something when his eyes lingered on hers. "I need to speak with you," he said, his tone unexpectedly soft. Sarah hesitated, unsure of what to make of the situation. But there was something in his expression that made her pause, something that pulled at her. "Of course," she said, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her chest. "Is everything all right?" Dominic looked at her for a moment, as though deciding how to approach what he wanted to say. "I've been thinking," he began, his words careful, "about what you said before. About being more than this." Sarah blinked, unsure of where this conversation was headed. "Mr. Romano, I didn't mean to overstep," she said quickly. "No," Dominic interrupted gently. "I think you're right." Sarah frowned, surprised by his words. "Right?" she repeated, unsure of what he meant. "I've spent my whole life thinking I could control everything, that I could control people, situations. But there's something about you, Sarah," he said, his voice lowering, "that makes me wonder if I've been wrong all this time." His words hung in the air between them, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had never heard Dominic speak this way before, never heard him express doubt or vulnerability. "I've been thinking about how I treat people," he continued, his voice almost a whisper. "And how you've never asked for anything. You've never asked for more, never demanded anything. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't have it." Sarah didn't know what to say. She stood there, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the linens to her chest. "I don't know what you mean, Mr. Romano," she said, her voice soft. Dominic stepped closer to her, his eyes searching hers. "I'm saying that maybe you do deserve more," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "Maybe you don't have to live your life in the shadows. Maybe you deserve to be seen for who you truly are." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat, but she couldn't speak. His words were so unlike anything she had ever heard. People like Dominic didn't say things like that. They didn't care about people like her. "I don't know how to be anything more than I am," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Dominic reached out, his hand brushing against hers in a rare moment of tenderness. "You don't have to figure it all out now," he said, his voice low and reassuring. "But I want you to know that you don't have to hide anymore. You can stand tall. You can be seen." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Sarah stood there, frozen, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts she couldn't process. She had spent so long living in the background, staying hidden from view, that the idea of being seen felt overwhelming, terrifying even. But there was something about Dominic's presence, the way he looked at her, that made her wonder if it was time to let go of the walls she had built around herself. Dominic's hand was still close to hers, the warmth of his touch grounding her in the moment. She had always known that life was about survival, about doing what was necessary to get by. But now, with Dominic's words echoing in her mind, she wondered if there was more to life than just surviving. "I don't know if I can do this," she said quietly, her voice breaking the silence. Dominic smiled, his expression softening. "You don't have to do it alone," he said. "I'll be here. If you want to change, if you want more, I'm here to help you." Sarah swallowed, feeling a rush of emotions she hadn't expected. She had always believed that her place was set, that she was destined to remain in the shadows. But now, standing before Dominic, she felt a flicker of hope she hadn't known was possible. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Dominic nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of understanding and something else she couldn't quite place. "You don't have to thank me," he replied. "But know that you're not invisible to me, Sarah. You never were." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Sarah standing there, alone in the hallway. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel invisible. The following days passed in a blur, with Sarah trying to process everything that had happened. Dominic's words echoed in her mind, over and over again, a constant reminder of the strange shift that had occurred between them. She didn't know what it meant, what to do with it, but she knew one thing. It had changed something in her. She no longer felt like a shadow in the mansion, even though she still performed the same tasks. The house felt different now, as though the walls were somehow less imposing, the rooms less vast and intimidating. Every time she crossed paths with Dominic, her heart would flutter, though she tried her best to ignore it. It wasn't like she could afford to think about him like that, or about anything other than her work. But somehow, despite her best efforts, her thoughts kept returning to him, to the way he looked at her, the softness in his eyes when he spoke. It confused her, and she didn't know what to make of it. One evening, as Sarah was preparing the evening meal in the kitchen, she found herself lost in thought again. She had been working silently for the past few hours, her mind preoccupied with everything that had happened in the last few days. She didn't hear Dominic enter the room, and when he spoke, it startled her. "You're here late again," he said, his voice low and familiar. Sarah quickly turned, her heart skipping a beat. "Mr. Romano," she said, her voice betraying a hint of nervousness. "I didn't realize you were here." Dominic stood in the doorway, his gaze on her, his posture relaxed. "I needed something to eat," he said casually. "I thought I'd see if you were still working." Sarah nodded, trying to steady her breathing. "I'm just finishing up, Mr. Romano. It won't be long." There was a pause before he stepped further into the room, crossing the distance between them with long strides. He stopped just a few feet away from her, his eyes never leaving hers. "You don't have to keep calling me that, you know," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "I've told you before. Just call me Dominic." Sarah felt a wave of heat rise in her cheeks at his words. She had never been one to use someone's first name, especially not someone like Dominic. He was the boss, the one who ran everything. I don't know if I can," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic smiled, but it wasn't the same smile he usually wore. It was softer, almost comforting. "You're not just my employee, Sarah," he said. "You're more than that. I'd like to think we're beyond the formality." Sarah didn't know what to say to that. She had always kept her distance from the people she worked for, but Dominic had a way of making her feel different. She didn't know if it was the way he looked at her, or the way he treated her, but it made her feel like she was more than just the help. "I'm just here to do my job," she said quietly, her voice laced with uncertainty. Dominic didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a step closer to her, his presence filling the space between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was as if the world had stopped, and it was just the two of them in the room, standing in the silence. Finally, Dominic broke the stillness. "You're more than that, Sarah," he said, his voice sincere. "I see you, not just as the maid, but as you." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. No one had ever said anything like that to her before. "You don't need to hide," he continued, his voice softer now. "You don't need to be invisible." Sarah swallowed, her throat dry. She didn't know how to process what he was saying. She had spent so many years hiding, staying out of the way, doing her job without drawing attention to herself. But now, with Dominic's words hanging in the air between them, she wasn't so sure she could keep hiding. "I don't know how to stop," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Dominic reached out, his hand brushing against hers. The simple touch sent a shiver down her spine, and for a moment, she felt a warmth spread through her chest. "You don't have to," he said gently. "You don't have to stop being who you are, but you can stop hiding." Sarah looked up at him, meeting his gaze for the first time without looking away. There was something in his eyes, something kind, something real, that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she could believe him. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," she whispered. Dominic smiled, a soft, reassuring smile that made her feel safe in a way she hadn't expected. "You don't have to be ready," he said. "But when you are, I'll be here." Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. She didn't know what to say to that. She didn't know what to do with the emotions that were suddenly swirling inside her. But one thing was certain, things had changed. And as she stood there, looking at Dominic, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as invisible as she had once thought. The next few days felt heavier than before. Sarah tried to keep her mind on her work, but it was difficult to ignore the strange shift in her relationship with Dominic. Every time their paths crossed, there was an unspoken tension in the air, a kind of quiet understanding that neither of them addressed directly. Dominic had stopped by the kitchen a few more times, each time asking about her day or offering small, gentle words of encouragement. Sarah had grown used to his presence, but it still left her unsettled. She couldn't quite understand why he seemed so intent on making her feel seen. She had spent her whole life staying in the background, blending into the walls of the mansion, doing her job without drawing attention to herself. But now, with Dominic's eyes on her, she felt like she was being pulled from the shadows. It was a feeling she wasn't sure she was ready for. One afternoon, after finishing her chores, Sarah was heading to her small quarters when she saw Dominic standing near the staircase, looking out the large windows that overlooked the garden. He didn't notice her approach, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to observe him. He looked different than he had when she first started working for him. His posture, usually so commanding, was now slightly slouched, as if the weight of everything in his life was catching up to him. His expression was distant, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. She hesitated, unsure whether to interrupt his quiet moment. But something inside her told her to speak up. "Mr. Romano?" she asked softly. He turned quickly, almost as if he hadn't expected anyone to be there. "Sarah," he said, his voice a little strained. "I didn't hear you." She offered a small, tentative smile. "It's okay. I didn't mean to disturb you." There was a long pause, and Dominic seemed to struggle for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "You're not disturbing me," he said finally. "I've just been thinking." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "About what?" she asked, curious. Dominic sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. "About everything," he said, his voice quieter now. "About the way I've been living, the choices I've made. About how much of it is really worth it." Sarah felt a strange sense of unease settle in her chest. She had always known Dominic as the powerful Mafia boss, the man who controlled everything around him with ruthless efficiency. But now, in this vulnerable moment, he seemed like just a man, struggling with his own doubts. "It's a hard world to live in," she said carefully, unsure if she should be speaking at all. Dominic looked at her, as if surprised by her response. "It is," he agreed, his voice almost a whisper. "I've spent so much of my life fighting for control, but I've started to wonder if it's all been for nothing." The words seemed to hang in the air between them, and Sarah wasn't sure how to respond. She had seen a side of Dominic that no one else seemed to see. She had always believed that people like him, people with power and wealth, had everything figured out. But now, standing before him, she realized that even those who seemed untouchable had their own battles to fight. "You're not alone," she said softly, surprising herself with the words. Dominic looked at her with a mixture of surprise and something else, something deeper. "What do you mean?" he asked. Sarah shifted uncomfortably, not entirely sure why she had said that. "I mean," she started slowly, "we all have our struggles. No one's life is easy, but that doesn't mean you have to carry it alone." There was a moment of silence as Dominic considered her words. He didn't speak right away, his eyes focused on her in a way that made Sarah's heart race. Finally, he nodded, as if he understood what she was saying. "I've spent so much time pushing people away," he said quietly. "I thought I needed to. But maybe I was wrong." Sarah's chest tightened at his admission, and for a moment, she didn't know what to say. She wasn't used to seeing Dominic like this, vulnerable, uncertain. He was the man everyone feared, the man who had built an empire on control and intimidation. But now, standing before her, he seemed like someone who had lost his way. "We all need someone," Sarah said softly, the words coming easier now. "Even you." Dominic met her gaze, and for the first time in a long while, Sarah saw something in his eyes that she hadn't expected. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something deeper, something that made her heart flutter. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't realize how much I needed to hear that." Sarah nodded, not knowing how to respond. The moment stretched between them, filled with an unspoken understanding. Dominic was still the boss, still the powerful man who controlled everything in his life. But in that moment, Sarah realized that he was also just a man, someone who was capable of feeling, of questioning, of needing someone to see him for who he truly was. As Sarah turned to leave, Dominic called after her. "Sarah," he said, his voice softer than usual. She paused, turning back to look at him. "Yes. You're right," he said quietly. "I don't have to do this alone." The words hung in the air, and for the first time, Sarah believed them. The next few weeks felt like a delicate balance, with both Sarah and Dominic navigating the shifting ground between them. Sarah continued her work, as she always had, but there was a new understanding in the air, a quiet tension that neither of them acknowledged directly. Dominic's presence, once so commanding, now seemed softer when he was around her. He no longer just observed her from a distance, but engaged with her more often, whether it was small talk in the hallways or brief exchanges over meals. At first, Sarah hadn't known how to respond to his newfound attentiveness. She wasn't used to being noticed, not like this. But as time passed, she began to feel more comfortable in his presence, though she was careful not to let it cloud her judgment. She had always known where she stood. She was the maid, and he was the powerful Mafia boss. Nothing had changed that fact. Yet, everything had changed. One evening, as Sarah was cleaning the large dining room, she heard Dominic's footsteps approaching. She looked up just as he stepped into the room, his hands tucked in his pockets, his eyes scanning the room. He stopped when he saw her, his gaze lingering for a moment longer than usual. "You're still here?" he asked, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I thought you'd be finished by now." Sarah paused in her task, wiping her hands on the cloth before replying. "There's always something left to do, Mr. Romano." Dominic tilted his head slightly, his expression thoughtful. "You're always working," he said, almost as if to himself. "When do you take a break?" Sarah shrugged, trying to brush off the question. "I'm used to it," she said simply. "It's just how things are." Dominic stepped closer, and Sarah felt a strange sense of unease settle in her stomach. "It doesn't have to be this way, you know," he said, his voice low. "You don't have to keep going like this, putting everyone else first. You deserve to take a break. You deserve to be seen for more than just your work." Sarah looked at him, surprised by his words. "I'm fine," she said quickly. "I don't need anything more." But even as she said the words, she realized how untrue they were. She had spent so many years burying her own desires, her own needs, under the weight of other people's expectations. But now, with Dominic standing before her, looking at her as though she mattered, she wasn't so sure. "You're not fine," Dominic said, his voice gentle but firm. "I've seen the way you push yourself, the way you hide behind your work. But I don't want you to do that anymore." His words hit her harder than she had expected. She wasn't used to anyone speaking to her like that, with such care, such concern. She felt the walls she had built around herself begin to crack, and for a moment, she didn't know how to respond. "I don't know how to stop," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to be anything else." Dominic's eyes softened, and for a moment, there was a brief silence between them. He took a step closer to her, his presence steady and unwavering. "You don't have to do it all alone," he said quietly. "I don't want you to feel like you have to carry everything on your own. You're allowed to ask for more. You're allowed to have more than just survival." Sarah felt her heart race as she looked at him. The vulnerability in his eyes was something she hadn't expected. Here he was, a man who had everything, offering her something she had never asked for, something she had never believed she deserved. "I don't know what to do with all of this," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I don't know how to be anything other than what I've always been." Dominic's expression remained calm, his gaze steady. "You don't have to change overnight," he said. "But when you're ready, I'll be here. You don't have to keep carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders alone." Sarah stood there, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't quite piece together. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't invisible, like she mattered. Dominic hadn't asked for anything in return. He hadn't tried to push her into a role she didn't want. He had simply offered her the possibility of more, the possibility of being seen as something other than the maid. It was a frightening thought, but also liberating. She took a deep breath, letting his words sink in. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic gave her a small, warm smile. "You don't have to thank me," he said, his voice gentle. "But I mean it, Sarah. You're worth more than you think." With that, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Sarah standing there, her thoughts swirling in her mind. She didn't know where this new path would lead, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could choose her own direction. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing. She didn't have to stay invisible anymore. It had been a few days since the conversation that had shifted everything between Sarah and Dominic. She was still adjusting to the change, unsure of how to act around him now that things felt different. He hadn't pushed her for more, hadn't made any grand gestures. Instead, he continued to treat her with a quiet respect, allowing her to process the words he had spoken without any pressure. But every time their paths crossed, Sarah felt an unspoken connection between them, one that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. She couldn't deny that she felt something new, something she hadn't expected to feel in this place. One evening, After a long day of cleaning and organizing, Sarah found herself in the garden, taking a brief moment to collect her thoughts. The sun was setting, casting a soft orange glow over the rows of flowers and neatly trimmed hedges. It was a rare moment of peace, and Sarah couldn't help but close her eyes and breathe in the fresh air. She had always enjoyed the quiet moments, the ones where she could be alone with her thoughts, away from the noise and expectations of the world around her. Sarah? The sound of Dominic's voice interrupted her moment of solitude, and she turned quickly to find him standing a few feet away, his hands casually tucked into the pockets of his suit. "Mr. Romano," she said, her voice betraying a hint of surprise. "I didn't expect to see you here." Dominic gave her a small smile. "I like the garden," he said simply. "It's peaceful." Sarah nodded, but her heart was racing. She wasn't sure how to act around him anymore, especially after everything that had been said between them. She had always kept her distance, but now it felt different. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he added, taking a step closer. "No," she replied quickly. "Not at all." There was a brief pause, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Sarah could feel the weight of his presence, the quiet intensity that seemed to radiate from him. She had never been close to someone like Dominic before, someone who seemed so powerful and yet, at the same time, so vulnerable. "I've been thinking," Dominic said, breaking the silence. "About what you said, about being seen." Sarah turned to face him fully, her brow furrowing slightly. "What do you mean?" "I've been thinking about my life," he said, his voice steady but tinged with something else. "About all the things I've done, all the things I've built. And I realized that maybe I've been focusing on the wrong things." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. She hadn't expected him to talk like this, not about the things that mattered. "What do you mean?" she asked again, her voice soft. Dominic hesitated for a moment, his gaze dropping to the ground before he looked back at her. "I've spent so much of my life trying to control everything, to make sure I have everything under my thumb," he said quietly. "But I've been blind to the things that really matter. The people, the connections, the moments." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had always known Dominic as the powerful Mafia boss, the one who commanded respect and made everyone around him follow his lead. But now, in this moment, he sounded like a man who was questioning everything he had built. "You don't have to do it all on your own," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic looked at her, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite read. "What do you mean?" he asked, his tone gentle. "I mean," she said, her voice stronger now, "that no one should carry the weight of the world by themselves. We all need help. We all need someone." For a moment, Dominic just stared at her, as if processing her words. Then, slowly he nodded. "I think you're right," he said softly. "I've always been alone in this. I thought it was the only way. But maybe I don't have to be." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She had never seen him like this before. There was something in his eyes now that softened the harsh edges, something that made him seem more human, more relatable. "I've been afraid," he said quietly. "Afraid to let anyone in. Afraid that if I do, everything will fall apart." Sarah took a step closer, her voice calm and reassuring. "You don't have to be afraid," she said gently. "You don't have to do everything alone. You've built an empire, but even empires can fall if they're built on fear." Dominic's eyes met hers, and for a long moment, they just stood there, locked in a silent understanding. It was as if they had both finally seen something in each other that they hadn't allowed themselves to see before. "I think I've been running from the wrong things," he said softly, his voice full of quiet realization. "I've been running from myself, from the idea that maybe I can't control everything." Sarah nodded slowly, her heart swelling with something she couldn't quite name. "You don't have to control everything," she said softly. "You just have to be yourself." Dominic smiled then, a rare and genuine smile that made Sarah's heart flutter. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for reminding me of that." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For the first time, Dominic seemed like a man who wasn't defined by his title, his power, or his wealth. He was just a man, standing before her, vulnerable and human. And in that moment, Sarah realized that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't the only one who had been hiding. The days after their conversation felt different for both Sarah and Dominic. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, a shift that neither could ignore. Sarah had never allowed herself to hope for more, for anything beyond the role she had always played in this world. But Dominic's words, the kindness in his gaze, had made her wonder if there was something else for her. Something beyond the walls she had built. Dominic, too, had changed. The distance that had always existed between him and everyone else was slowly dissolving, and he found himself questioning everything he had ever known about power, control, and what truly mattered. He was used to being the one in charge, the one who made decisions and commanded respect. But with Sarah, something was different. She wasn't afraid of him. She didn't look at him with awe or fear like everyone else. She saw him as a person, not just a boss. And that made him feel more vulnerable than he had ever felt. A week had passed since their last conversation, and the tension between them had not disappeared. It was still there, lingering, but it was no longer uncomfortable. It was just different. One evening, as the sun set behind the mansion, Dominic found himself once again standing in the garden. He had come here often lately, seeking solitude, trying to make sense of the swirling thoughts in his mind. It was quiet here, away from the hustle and demands of his world. He had always found peace in the garden, surrounded by nature, with only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees to keep him company. As he walked along the path, he saw Sarah in the distance, kneeling beside the flower beds, her hands gently tending to the plants. She was alone, as she always was in these moments of peace. Dominic paused for a moment, watching her from afar. There was something about the way she moved, the way she seemed to find solace in these simple tasks. It reminded him of the way he used to feel before his life had become consumed by power and control. Back then, he had been able to enjoy the small moments, the moments that brought him peace. But now, he couldn't seem to find that kind of peace anymore. Sarah didn't notice him standing there. She was focused on her work, lost in the rhythm of the garden. Dominic took a deep breath and made his way over to her, his footsteps barely making a sound on the grass. When he reached her, Sarah looked up, surprised to see him. "Mr. Romano," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I didn't expect you to be here." Dominic smiled faintly, his gaze meeting hers. "I thought I'd check on the garden," he said, his voice calm. "It's looking beautiful, as always." Sarah stood up slowly, brushing the dirt from her hands. "It's my favorite part of the mansion," she said quietly. "It's where I can clear my mind." Dominic nodded, looking around at the rows of flowers and shrubs. "I understand," he said softly. "It's the only place I've found peace lately." Sarah tilted her head slightly, studying him. "What do you mean?" she asked. Dominic hesitated, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. "I've spent so much of my life focusing on things that don't really matter," he said, his voice quieter now. "Power, control, building an empire. But I'm starting to realize that I've missed out on the things that truly matter." Sarah listened quietly, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. She had always seen Dominic as the man who controlled everything, the one who ruled with an iron fist. But now, hearing him speak like this, she saw something different in him, something human. "You don't have to keep carrying it all," Sarah said softly, her voice steady. "You don't have to keep holding everything together on your own." Dominic looked at her, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to understand her words. "I've always thought that I had to," he said quietly, "that I had to be in control, that if I let go, everything would fall apart." Sarah took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. "But you don't have to do it alone," she said firmly. "You don't have to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders." There was a long silence as Dominic processed her words. Then, slowly, he nodded, a small but genuine smile appearing on his lips. "I think you're right," he said, his voice soft. "Maybe I've been so focused on holding everything together that I've forgotten what really matters." Sarah met his gaze, her heart beating faster as she realized how much had changed between them. The distance, the uncertainty, the walls they had both built around themselves, it was all slowly coming down. And in its place, there was something new, something that neither of them had expected, but both were beginning to embrace. "It's okay to let go sometimes," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady. "It's okay to let someone else in." Dominic looked at her for a moment, and for the first time, he didn't feel the need to hide behind his title or his power. He didn't feel the need to be the strong, untouchable boss. In this moment, standing in the garden with Sarah, he felt like a man who could finally breathe. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for reminding me of that." Sarah smiled, a small, knowing smile that made her heart flutter. "You don't have to thank me," she said softly. "You just have to be yourself." Dominic nodded, the weight of his responsibilities feeling a little lighter now. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it. With Sarah by his side, he knew he didn't have to carry the world alone. The days following their conversation in the garden passed in a blur, but there was a sense of calm settling between Sarah and Dominic. It wasn't like before, when the tension was thick and unspoken. Now it was different. There was an unspoken understanding between them. Neither of them spoke about what had changed, but somehow, things felt lighter, as though the weight they had been carrying had been shared. Sarah went about her work as usual, but the way she moved through the mansion felt different. She wasn't just going through the motions anymore. There was a newfound confidence in her step, a quiet strength she had never allowed herself to feel before. Dominic, too, seemed different. He was still the same person, powerful, commanding, but there was a softness in his gaze whenever he looked at her, a gentleness that was hard to ignore. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't trying to control everything around him. He wasn't trying to keep up the facade of the untouchable Mafia boss. Instead, he was simply present. One evening, as Sarah finished her duties and headed toward the staff quarters, she found Dominic waiting near the staircase, looking out at the darkened garden beyond the large windows. His posture was relaxed, but there was something in his expression that caught her attention. "Sarah," he said, his voice calm, yet filled with something she couldn't quite place. She paused, uncertain for a moment. "Mr. Romano," she said, her voice soft. "I didn't expect to see you here." Dominic smiled, a small, genuine smile that made something flutter in Sarah's chest. "I like the quiet," he said simply. "Sometimes, it's the only place I can think." Sarah stepped closer, noticing the faint sadness in his voice, but she didn't know how to ask about it. Instead, she nodded, her gaze drifting to the garden as well. "I understand," she said quietly. "It's peaceful here." There was a moment of silence before Dominic spoke again, his tone more serious now. "I've been thinking a lot about what we talked about," he said, his gaze focused on her. "About letting go, about not carrying everything alone." Sarah looked at him, surprised by the depth of his words. It wasn't something she had expected him to dwell on. "And?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic met her gaze, his expression softening. "I've been afraid," he admitted. "Afraid of letting go, afraid of losing control. But I see now that I've been living my life like that for too long. It's not living. It's just surviving." Sarah felt her heart tug at his words. It wasn't something she expected to hear from him, the man who had everything, the man who seemed to control the world around him. She had always thought of him as someone who had it all figured out. But now, standing before her, he seemed just as vulnerable as anyone else. "You don't have to be perfect," Sarah said gently. "You don't have to have it all figured out. You just have to be who you are." Dominic nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on her. "You're right," he said quietly. "For the first time in a long time, I feel like I can breathe." There was a softness in his voice that Sarah hadn't heard before, and it made her heart swell. She had always seen Dominic as a man of power, but now she saw him as something more, someone who, despite his wealth and influence, was just as human as the rest of them. She didn't know where this would go, where this connection between them might lead, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She didn't feel like she had to hide anymore. "I've spent so much time pushing people away," Dominic continued, his voice soft. "I thought it was the only way to keep control, to keep people from getting too close. But now, I see that I've been keeping the wrong people at arm's length." Sarah smiled faintly, her heart aching with something she couldn't explain. "It's never too late," she said quietly. "You can always change." Dominic looked at her, his eyes searching hers, as though looking for something. "I don't know what the future holds," he said softly, "but I know that I want to change. I want to do better. I want to be better." Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, everything felt still, as if the world had stopped around them. She didn't know what the future held for them, for her or Dominic, but she knew that this moment, standing there with him, was something she would never forget. It was the first time in a long time that she felt like she wasn't invisible. Dominic was seeing her, truly seeing her, for the first time. And that made all the difference. "I'm glad you see that," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. Dominic reached out then, his hand brushing lightly against hers. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes, and Sarah felt a warmth spread through her at the touch. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for helping me see that." Sarah looked at him, her heart beating faster in her chest. She wasn't sure what the future would bring, but in this moment, she realized that maybe, just maybe, they were both starting to see things in a new light.